about it. You know, when you say natural selection, what is the scientific definition of that?
Well, I don't know what the scientific definition is, but my definition is that...
No. Sorry. The scientific definition should actually direct you as to whether the truth of a contention is valid.
This is a video of Shabir Yusuf talking to an atheist by the title of the video's description. They are talking about science, in particular human origins. I will analyse the scientific claims made in this video. Shabir Yusuf is well known for obfuscation. I will therefore have to clarify any point made.
Okay, well, the way I understand it, I understand the scientific definition, I'll say it that way instead, is that an animal or an organism, or a living organism that is more suited to, say, an environment than another organism would be. They are more likely to survive, pass on the genetic information, reproduce themselves, and those that aren't able to survive, over time, will diminish in number and eventually possibly go extinct. That's the best way to put it.
That is a fairly good description of natural selection.
Right, I can agree with that, and it sounds reasonable. However, if you take those two animals, if both of them have the same genetic fit, how do you determine which one is weaker?
That's a rather strange statement from Shabir, as neither of them would be weaker if they have the same genetic fit, which is what he said, which I'm assuming he means to be fitness in a biological sense.
The same genetic fit.
Yes.
There's an element of chance in it. I'm not saying that.
All right.
Because,
Absolutely. If there is an element of chance, then we are using evidence that is not definitive.
No, it is definitive. I'll tell you why. It's because we're talking over thousands of generations.
No. That certainly didn't sound like.
We're talking over thousands of generations of animals.
But I'm sorry.
The effects of chance are great.
Sorry, brother. I'm Shabir. You are
Jay.
Jay. Well, I'm not. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is going back to the source point. Yeah. As an example, are you familiar with Drosophila melanogaster?
No, I'm not.
Fruit flies.
This is the Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly that is widely used in biological research.
Yes. Now they were interfered with.
I heard about this.
Yes. Now, do you know this mutational element you were talking about? Well, that is what was done with them. Because they reproduced very, very quickly, it was easy to do that. But they did that, and you had so many flies that were born with all sorts of deformities. What the researchers then did was they left the fruit flies to their own devices. And after a few generations, they were back to normal fruit flies.
I have done a search for this experiment, but cannot find any evidence that this took place. If anybody knows of this experiment to which Shabir is referring, please add a comment. It sounds counterintuitive, as wild Drosophila have more mutations compared to other animal species.
Now the question therefore arises is, when we talk about mutations being beneficial, where do we draw the line or the distinction between a mutation being beneficial and a mutation being destructive?
You only find that out afterwards. A harmful mutation decreases the fitness of an organism. A beneficial mutation increases the fitness of the organism. Many mutations are neutral, having no effect. It is the environment exerting a selection pressure that determines in which category a mutation is.
The consequences of the mutations are not the issue. The issue is that experimental elements were involved, which is correct, but they were to determine whether mutations in the real world actually occurred. So what they did, they, as you rightly put it, artificially or interfered with the natural mechanism. The definition of natural we haven't actually, we are just going to take as an accepted
That's why
fact.
I would say that it disqualifies that study from the natural process of mutation, because it's produced from an external...
Excellent. Well, if that is the case, on what definitive basis are you establishing that it was the mutational element that caused all the changes?
The changes are shown as the phenotype, which are the observable characteristics. An organism's phenotype results from its genetic code and the influence of the environment. Changing the genetic code through mutation alters the phenotype. That's how we know it is the mutational element that caused the changes.
Because you can see you assume through things like organisms like bacteria or viruses that, say, with bacteria, for example, they've grown a resistance to some antibiotics that we have.
But those
very, very, very
absolutely,
and they've changed in terms of the genetic.
I can agree with
that's
that.
One mutation, that's example.
Human
beings. For
is it a mutation though?
Yes. A simple search will demonstrate studies that show how novel mutations in bacteria produce antibiotic resistance. Bacteria that show this resistance have their genomes analysed, which show the mutations that cause this.
It is a mutation.
How do we know that?
Because it's not a natural occurrence. It's been induced through the introduction of antibiotics.
Now wait a minute.
And they...
Yeah, if the vehicle has the necessary arsenal within it, within the program, is it a mutation?
But it's not within it already. Because
How?
to say that's within it,
No.
it's to presume that the bacteria knew that Fleming was going to create antibiotics and then it's going to be...
Not at all, not at all. If, for example, you have got genetic switches, yes? You take a multitude of elements, as soon as they come in, the switch automatically switches.
Shabir is describing genetic switches, also known as gene regulatory networks. He is implying that the gene was already present and did not mutate and was switched on in response to a particular environment. He would need to demonstrate that the gene is always there and did not arise later. This is the opposite to what we find with mutations. The discussion then moves on to hominids.
How do we know that a particular hominid is closer to Homo sapien? What was the determining factor?
Determining factor of that?
Yes, to determine whether this is closer to the pungids, that's the ape world, or to the hominids, or the human Homo sapien.
Characteristics, through the bone structure, through the skeletal structure.
But the bone structure has to have a definite model already to measure against.
The model is Homo sapiens, us, because we're trying to figure out what we do.
There we are. So the one previous to the Homo sapien, how did we determine whether this one is a direct descendant?
I will assume here that Shabir means ancestor rather than descendant, as descendant means coming after, not before.
If we are not aware of the details within what we are viewing, how can we formulate a reasoned conclusion?
Because you don't need to know the specific details all the time.
Excellent.
Sometimes you can look at something and say, well, I can see a similarity there.
Okay, let me ask you this, brother. I understand. Sahelanthropus tchadensis. Are you familiar with that?
The Greek term. What's the
right.
English language?
Okay. Let's do it this way. This is a particular fossil, which the paleontologists suggest is the closest relative to the Homo sapien.
Okay.
This is completely wrong. Sahelanthropus tchadensis is an extinct species that lived 6 to 7 million years ago. The closest relative to Homo sapiens is traditionally thought to be Neanderthals, but there is discussion as to whether Homo longi is closer.
Why? Because the apes in general, yes, the area where the backbone goes in and the spinal cord, okay, is slightly curved, okay, in the apes. But in the human beings it is straight, yes? The foramen magnum.
There are many wrong things here that should already be known to somebody with a basic understanding of biology. Let me start by explaining that the foramen magnum is the hole in the bottom of the skull that allows the spinal cord and the brain to connect. Shabir makes a distinction between humans and apes, but humans are apes. Shabir gives a confused description of the foramen magnum, talking about curved and straight. This is not the way paleontologists describe it. The importance relates to its position in the skull. An anteriorly placed foramen magnum, like that of humans, gives evidence for bipedal species, as there is a shifting in the centre of gravity allowing upright walking. Other apes, such as chimpanzees, have a more posteriorly placed foramen magnum, as they demonstrate lesser bipedality. Species closer to humans demonstrate a foramen magnum more anterior.
Now, I'm not just using these and bringing them up. It is to show that, look, if you are not familiar with the details, you are going to misinterpret the big picture completely.
Yeah, sure,
so now it can happen. Now, not only that, I'm just using that as an example, yes? So you have tchadensis, but that is based on a skull. And the paleontologists will tell you, look, we cannot definitively say that this is to be used as an example. In order to do that, we need the knee bones.
You don't need a knee bone, as the position of the foramen magnum, as explained earlier, indicates upright walking when it is placed more anteriorly. There are other bones found for Sahelanthropus tchadensis. We could be charitable to Shabir here, as this video in Speaker's Corner was uploaded in 2021, but analysis of the femur was not concluded until 2022. However, given his earlier misunderstanding, it is unlikely he would have understood this.
Now, I'm familiar with the subject matter. If you look at the analogous bones they talk about, okay, we are told that we were fish at one time, yes? Why? Because there's a tiny little bone somewhere in there that looks pretty much like our bone.
It's a lot more than just a tiny bone. We have evidence in our limbs and our lungs and our DNA for fish ancestry. For a full description, read the book Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin, which is also available as a video on YouTube.
Have you heard of Piltdown Man? This was supposed to be a transitional fossil between the apes and the humans, yes? For 35 years, scientists all over the world accepted it.
Yes, I know what you're talking about.
Piltdown Man.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But then it turned out to be a forgery.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, in all honesty, Jay, what kind of scientific analysis was undertaken for 35 years to determine whether it was a fake or not?
Piltdown Man was a hoax fossil presented in 1912. Shabir is wrong, as there were doubts about its authenticity virtually from the beginning. It was proven to be a fraud 41 years later. This whole episode is actually a triumph for science, as it demonstrates the validity of skepticism and repeated scientific experiments to validate suspicions. It was scientists who exposed the hoax.
Have you heard of Sivapithecus?
Sivapithecus?
Yes. No. You haven't? Okay. Ramapithecus? You haven't heard of all these? Okay. Well, these was allegedly, yes, fossils that had a relationship with the Homo sapiens. Okay? And the drawings and the paintings are spectacular. You see them, you think, wow. It was all based on a small bone.
These two genera, Ramapithecus and Sivapithecus, were once thought to be ancestors of modern humans, but are now regarded as the ancestor to the orangutan. All the pictures are, of course, artists' interpretations based on the fossils that have been recovered. These include various bones, not just one. The drawings, as shown here, clearly indicate that they don't look like modern humans, as Shabir suggests, so he is wrong in this case.
How did they develop the whole picture of this particular relative of ours?
It is a distant relative of ours. The reconstructions are based on interpretation of the fossils that have been recovered and comparing them to more complete skeletons of similar-looking species.
It is when you look at the detail that a different picture starts emerging. You know, Professor Coyne wrote a book, Evolution is True, Jerry Coyne. I don't know, have you read that? No. Right, okay. Yeah, there are many books that have been written in which there is a particular emphasis on evolution being true. Then you have to, in all honesty, to dismiss something or to accept something, one has to assess the detail. Look, if I say to you, Jay, I am your uncle. Would you doubt it?
Highly, yeah.
Why?
Because I don't know who you are. You don't look like me, so genetically I find it highly unlikely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So are we related to the fish?
This has to be one of the dumbest statements ever said in Speaker's Corner. Shabir may not be this man's uncle, but they are still related. Humans share 99.9% of our DNA with other humans. Yes, we are related to the fish. Humans share 60% of our DNA with fish because we have a common ancestor.
The difference here is this, yeah? There is the evidence and there is the interpretation of the evidence. My contention is with the interpretation of the evidence, not the evidence itself. Because as you have just rightly pointed out, the end game has not occurred yet. there are a huge amount of evidence to be unearthed as yet.
Interpretation of the evidence by experts in the field undergoes rigorous scientific testing and peer review. Any new evidence is examined appropriately and incorporated into current theories. Anybody is welcome to have their own interpretation, but if they wish for it to be taken seriously, they need to demonstrate adequate scientific reasons why they have that interpretation.
Yes?
Sure, yeah.
So, it's at this current moment in time, it is the interpretation of the evidence that I am addressing. Yes. And that is why I'm constantly pointing to the details. Yeah? Sure. So, for example, Professor Cohen, one of the examples he uses, and especially Professor Richard Dawkins, he uses the example of this particular nerve, the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Right, okay, fine. He uses that as an example to show if there was a creator, he was pretty thick as far as they were concerned, okay? But you look at that example and you think to yourself, wait a minute, this is not being addressed the way it ought to be addressed.
The recurrent laryngeal nerve is a remnant of our fish ancestry. It supplies the throat muscles. It loops around blood vessels in the chest. As land animals evolved and their necks lengthened, the nerves were stretched and grew to the extent that the recurrent laryngeal nerve is now meters long in giraffes. This is evidence of an evolutionary origin. Shabir never says how he thinks it should be addressed.
Yes, the scientific method is merely a tool for you to establish certain things. Yeah, as we all know, that science, the way it is understood today, okay, looks at one thing. Can we look at the evidence? Can we assess it? Can it be falsified? Send it for peer review and all the usual. Yeah. However, that cannot be applied to evolution per se.
I agree, because it's not something observable.
And now, exactly, but that means it is outside the realm of the scientific method.
This is another nonsense statement from Shabir. Evolution is fully within the scientific method. It is testable and the process can be observed in species that have a faster life cycle. It can be falsified as it makes predictions. The evidence for evolution encompasses different specialties.
And if that is the case, should we equally dismiss it like we dismiss God because it's not within the realm of the scientific method?
That's the thing.
The scientific method can only test natural causes, not supernatural causes.
Physical evidence.
There you are. You see, science doesn't only, the way we understand science, doesn't only rely on physical evidence, does it? Yeah, it doesn't. But as Professor Dawkins said, it is information that is gleaned and all the evidence is assessed and the best inference is drawn.
Yeah.
What does the word inference mean?
Inference, something that you say based on something else like evidence or...
Exactly. And there's a possibility that tomorrow some new piece of evidence will come along and this will be overturned. So,
that's the thing, with big theories like evolution, which have been kind of proved in terms of how, say, bacteria that have very, very short life cycles, or like mosquitoes or other animals, you can verifiably show mutations and changes in an organism?
Well, actually, have you got any definitive evidence for that?
Yeah.
Yes, there is plenty of evidence for this. This is just one example.
Should we not possibly also consider controlled evolution?
Controlled by... Sure,
not controlled by, I just said controlled evolution.
If you want to make a case for controlled evolution, then you need to formulate a hypothesis of how it works, perform experiments, verify your results, and then present it to peer-reviewed scientific journals.
Isn't there a possibility? It doesn't. Why? Now look at this. We are looking at observable evidence, aren't we?
Yeah.
Although we know that the theory itself doesn't have that kind of evidence. It is the best inference that has been drawn from the available evidence.
Sure. Yeah.
That's what it is, okay? I don't have a problem with that. What I'm saying is, look, you said, is there an alternative? I'm saying, is there a possibility of controlled evolution? Now, what does the word control mean? It means different things to different people. Okay.
By humans,
There you are.
animals,
You see, it can be
by other extraterrestrials, by
extraterrestrial, by a being that is not seen. There is a possibility. If we can think of the idea, we can posit it, we can dismiss it, but it should be dismissed on a rational footing.
You need to do more than just think of the idea. You need to demonstrate the mechanism of how the extraterrestrials or the Supreme Being are able to control evolution. Then find verifiable evidence for your hypothesis. Then it can be taken seriously.
As we have just found, we can say one thing about a particular subject matter, but when we assess it a bit deeper, we suddenly realize it's pretty much the same as the other one that we are dismissing.
No, there is a massive difference between the scientific theory of evolution and any posited supernatural cause for the diversity of life we see today.
So on what justifiable basis are we dismissing it? Unfortunately, the majority of atheists, agnostics, or people who can't be bothered sort of thing, yes, the moment the issue of a creator is mentioned, they all go funny in the head.
So in summary, Shabir tried to appear knowledgeable on evolution, but I have demonstrated that he is wrong on many aspects. He also falsely tried to equivocate other possible mechanisms for the diversity of life without demonstrating any evidence.